The leader of the National Resistance Forces visits Makha port to tangibly check the mass damage caused by Houthi terrorist attack. Joint forces announced investigations results of Houthi attacks on Makha port and vow to continue work in the port despite the attack. While the world celebrates the International Day of Democracy, Houthis continue human rights violations against journalists and free press. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Roshan Fouad. The Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for Yemen, Hans Granberg, has arrived today in Riyadh, where he is scheduled to meet with the senior Yemeni and Saudi officials and diplomats. Mr. Granberg will meet with the Yemeni President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, Prime Minister Ma'in Abdel Malik, and representatives of Yemeni political parties, among others. He will also meet with senior Saudi officials, ambassadors of the UN Security Council, permanent member states to Yemen, and the US Special Envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking. The visit is the first for the UN envoy to Yemen since he took office, and it comes within efforts to find durable solutions to the conflict and to reach an inclusive political settlement to end the war. Brigadier General Tariq Mohammed Abdullah Saleh, leader of the National Resistance, paid an inspection visit to the port of Makha. The visit is the second since the port was attacked by the Irani-backed Houthi militia. During the visit, Brigadier Tariq praised efforts made by the port staff to continue its operation after the Houthi attack. He was briefed on the damage caused to the port, including the warehouses for relief aids. He confirmed that Houthi criminal attack on Makha port comes in the context of their implementation of the Iranian project to control the region. Brigadier General Sadiq Duwait, commander of the Joint Forces, announced on Wednesday the investigation results of the Houthi attack on the port of Makha last Saturday. Duwait said that the Houthi rebels targeted the Makha port with heavy bombardment, which affected almost all the port's infrastructure facilities. As to the evacuation plan, he said that civilian workers and residents of the areas surrounding the port were evacuated, and the Joint Forces managed to shoot down and destroy some of the Houthi attack missiles.
أقدمت عصابة الحوثي الإيرانية يوم السبت الموافق 11 سبتمبر 2021.
On Saturday, September 11, 2021, during working hours, the Houthi militia targeted the Makha port with heavy bombing that affected almost all of the port's facilities, its berth, warehouses, employees' offices, and the commercial boats anchored there. Members of the joint forces from various units led by military intelligence, Coast Guard, and port security were able to thwart this crime by activating passive and air defenses. The Houthi militia used 2 ballistic missiles and 6 Iranian-made drones, and our air defenses were able to shoot down half of them. The militia attack destroyed a number of warehouses in the port, including goods and a warehouse for the Humanitarian Action Unit containing large quantities of food products provided by the Emirates Red Crescent. The attack also destroyed a number of port offices and damaged its berth. The port of Makha returned service after the inauguration in the presence of the representative of the United Nations, Mr. David Grizzly, as a civil port, subject to the International Code ISPS code, and supervised by the International Maritime Organization IMO through the Maritime Affairs Authority, and has an international certificate of compliance. This shelling was planned to commit a horrific crime, as it was during a visit of a high-ranking government delegation from the Ministry of Transport. This crime and other Houthi crimes will not stop the port from its work and will not discourage the joint forces and the local authority from continuing to operate the port and operating all development projects in this precious part of the country despite the Houthi aggression.
Under directions of Brigadier General Tariq Mohammed Abdullah Saleh, leader of the National Resistance, a delegation visited victims of a mine explosion in Al-Khoukha. The delegation inspected the cases of the wounded and was briefed on their urgent needs. A Houthi mine exploded in a family car returning from a wedding party. The explosion left 19 citizens injured. Most of them are women and children. In Khokhatu, a child was injured by mine explosion while he was passing in a road. The United Nations Eminent Expert Group on Yemen announced that the conflict in the country is getting more and more complex. Yemen's ambassador in Geneva, Ali Mujawar, said that Yemen refuses to accept the report issued by team. More on this story is within this report.
The report presented by the Eminent Expert Group concerning human rights in Yemen was totally refused by the Arabs UN's group. The group's report recorded from their point of view violations and abuses committed in Yemen between July 2020 and June 2021. It was entitled A Forgotten Nation, a call for humanity to end Yemen's suffering. The refusal was built upon the fact that the group depended in its finding on only one source. According to the Arab members supported by China, the group should have depended on all the sources and should have reached all the places in Yemen to find the truth. In this context, Yemen's ambassador in Geneva, Ali Mujawar, said that his country's government refuses to accept those experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. According to him, the report issued by the team is rejected as the team relied on misleading information, and the government adheres to the report of the Independent National Commission charged with investigating allegations of human rights violations. For them, the group of experts presented its fourth report that covers the findings on human rights violations, which was recorded last year. The violations, according to them, include shelling, failing to abide principles of international humanitarian law, obstacles to access food, health care, enforced disappearance, gender-based violence. The report included also torture and other forms of inhuman and degrading treatment, denial of fair trial rights, violations of fundamental freedoms. The UN group recorded in their group incidents of persecution and violations against journalists, migrants, internally displaced people, and children. They urged to reach a full cessation of hostilities and to achieve a sustainable and exclusive peace. The UN group of eminent experts was mandated to carry out comprehensive examinations of alleged violations and abuses of international human rights committed in Yemen.
The U.S. envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking, said that Houthi military escalations in Ma'rib must stop. During a meeting on the humanitarian response plan in Yemen, Lenderking said that coordinated efforts with the United Nations are continuing to push Houthis to stop their offensive in Ma'rib. He stressed that improving humanitarian operations is required to progress in the political track. Human Rights Watch said that investigations have been documented widespread violations of the terrorist Houthi militia. These violations included arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, and torture in detention centers. The organization confirmed that the Irani-backed Houthi militia is detaining and prosecuting opponents, including religious minorities, women, and journalists, noting that militia attacks in Ma'rib put civilians at great risk. The world celebrates International Democracy Day while Houthi rebels continue to crack down journalists and silence free speech. Journalists have been kidnapped, detained, and even sentenced to death. This report sheds light on the violations committed against journalists in Yemen.
Although Houthi militia has closed all opposition and independent newspapers and foreign media offices in areas under its control, the militia is on top of the lists of press freedoms violators in Yemen. The militia continue arresting journalists, 4 of whom have been sentenced to death. The Yemeni Journalist Syndicate released a report in the first half of 2021 over press freedom violations that affected all media employees, correspondents, media institutions, and journalists' properties. In its latest report, the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate recorded 112 cases of violations. These violations varied between kidnapping, detention, threats, incitement, stalking, and prevention of coverage, confiscation of newspapers, and accountability of journalists. According to the report, the Houthi militia committed 20 cases of violations, the government 10 cases, while the Southern Transitional Council committed 6 cases of violations against press freedom. However, 9 journalists are still detained by the Houthi militia: Wahid al-Sufi, Abdul Khaliq Umran, توفيق المنصوري، أكرم الوليدي، حارث حامد، نبيل السدوي، محمد الصلاحي، وليد المطري, and Muhammad Ali al-Junaid, 4 of whom have been unfairly sentenced to death. Likewise, journalist Muhammad Qaid al-Maqri has been kidnapped by Al-Qaeda in Hadramaut since 2015. The International Federation of Journalists condemned the ongoing violence against Yemeni journalists and called to end impunity culture. The Federation announced its support for the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate that requested an immediate release of all media employees and called on the warring parties to respect press freedom. The Yemeni Journalist Syndicate stated that journalists and media violations have increased significantly, especially against those who oppose their rule. Media freedom in Yemen has been subjected to more than 1,400 violations since the beginning of the war, including 38 killings of journalists, photographers, and other media employees. Since 2015, Yemen has become one of the most dangerous areas for journalist safety, especially with impunity that led to a scarcity of news coverage of the Yemeni crisis. Meanwhile, the Secretary General of the International Federation of Journalists, Anthony Belangi, said the Federation and the Journalist Syndicate condemn this ongoing violence against media in Yemen. All kidnapped journalists must be released and death sentences must be quashed immediately. We urge the authorities to take urgent actions to ensure the safety of journalists and end impunity for crimes committed against journalists and media workers, Pelangi added. Journalists suffer no less than the rest of those affected by the war, as they make great efforts and go under life risks to convey the suffering of the Yemeni people despite the violations they receive, especially from the Houthi militia.
The Irani-backed Houthi militia bombed civilian areas south of Hodeidah with heavy artillery. Local sources reported that the militias bombed the homes of citizens in al-Durayhimi and opened fire with medium machine guns on civilian objects east of the city of Hodeidah. According to the same sources, the Houthi rebels opened fire on farmers in al-Jah area and targeted travelers on the roads with snipers and medium weapons. In al-Bayda, government forces backed by tribes defended a Houthi militia attack in Nota front. Military sources said that the Houthi attack broke down after violent clashes that ended with the Houthi militia fleeing after being inflicted with heavy losses in terms of lives and equipments. An armed force in Ma'rib arrested the human rights activist Amatullah al-Hamadi and sent her in prison without justification. This attack came after a campaign of incitement launched by Muslim Brotherhood activists on social media, accusing her of working for the Houthis. The campaign came after the activist revealed the detention of a child in one of Ma'rib prisons, where he was subjected to sexual assault by security officials. Coming next. Incredible inflation hits healthy controlled areas amid people suffering.
رسالتي على منطقة الروضة استهدف الأطفال الأبرياء اللي يلعبوا في الشارع. يدعي للسلام يقول له السلام يقتل أطفالنا يقاتل أطفالنا الأبرياء.
أنا قلت افتجعت ولا أقول معي واحد صاروخ ثاني طلعت البيت حقنا. عشان أنا ألعب أنا وأصحابي والصاروخ الطرح.
Welcome back. To Aden, to the south of Yemen, where a wave of angry rallies continued in the city for the second night over constant power cuts. Sources confirmed that demonstrators set fire in tires to cut off the main street in Crater City. They protested against the deterioration of living conditions and basic services, especially electricity. The demonstrators called on authorities to provide services, stop the continuous collapse of the national currency, and pay the salaries of employees. To that end, Aden Association for Foreign Exchange directed all companies in the banking sector to start a public strike. They announced the strike will begin Wednesday in all governorates until further notice. The association revealed that the call for the strike comes in protest against the deterioration of the national currency. The economic situation in Yemen is continuing to collapse because of war and the absence of basic commodities. This aggravated people's suffering, especially in the healthy controlled areas. More on this story is within this report.
Food prices have risen in Yemen in 2021 due to the conditions it's going through and the turmoil of the political situation, in addition to the emergence of the coronavirus and the pandemic that the whole world is witnessing, which led to a rise in food prices in Yemen, Sana'a, Aden, and most of the Yemeni regions. This made a large number of families complain about the poor living conditions in light of this rise. Food prices in Sana'a and Yemen also witnessed a noticeable rise, as Yemen imports 90% of its food and consumer demand. Many food and consumer products were affected by the wave of crazy high prices that swept the Yemeni market. Salaries were cut off in the Houthi coup militia's areas of control for more than 2 years, and the Houthis rejected a government offer in 2016 to deposit all the revenues they receive at the headquarters of the Central Bank of Yemen in the temporary capital Aden, in return for disbursing the salaries of employees in their areas. The prices of some foodstuffs in the city of Sana'a and the areas under the control of the Houthi coup militia increased between 30 to 40%. While the prices of other foodstuffs increased by more than 3 times their price. The price of one bag of flour, a package of 50 kilos, reached 14,000 Yemeni riyals, which is equivalent to $22, after it was previously sold at a price of 10,000 riyals. While the price of a gallon of oil, 20 liters, reached 21,500 riyals, which is equivalent to $36, after that was being sold for $13. The United Nations stated that the conflict in Yemen 6 years ago has left at least 24.1 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, including 12.3 million children and 3.7 million internally displaced people. The United Nations indicated that about 70% of the population is facing the risk of hunger, in a country that's already among the most food insecure countries in the world. Merchants in Sana'a attributed the reasons for the rise in prices to the Houthis imposing new taxes and royalties under various names, which burdened the citizen and the merchant at the same time, as well as the high prices of oil derivatives, which in turn is reflected in the wages of transporting foodstuffs. In a recent report, the World Bank said that the conflict has devastated the national economy, with GDP halving since 2015, pushing more than 80% of the total population below the poverty line. High prices, black market, and the unpaid salaries of Yemenis are all factors affecting their life on a daily basis and doubling their pain more and more. All of this because of these Irani-backed Houthi militia who does nothing but ruin, destroy, and add pain to all Yemenis.
The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 25 new cases of the COVID-19 pandemic in 6 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 10 cases were recorded in Hadramaut, 5 in Aden, 4 in Shabwa, 1 in Taiz, and 1 in Socotra. Also 4 deaths were documented, plus 17 recovered cases. With the current updates, the total confirmed cases are 1,527, including 1,612 deaths and 5,305 cases of recovery. Here is a reminder of the main headlines. The leader of the National Resistance Forces visits Mecca port to tangibly check the mass damage caused by Houthi terrorist attacks. Joint forces announced investigations results of Houthi attacks in Mecca port and vowed to continue work in the port despite the attack. While the world celebrates the International Day of Democracy, Houthis continue human rights violations against journalists and free press. This is the end of the news. It was Roshan Fouad. Thank you for watching.